In the stillness of a spring dawn in 1623, a sound shattered the marble silence of Topkapı Palace. It was not the clash of steel, nor the groan of a wounded soldier returning from the frontier. It was the scream of a girl barely 15, her voice raw, piercing, and utterly out of place in the gilded heart of the Ottoman world. The cry belonged to Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I, ruler of an empire that stretched like a tide across 3 continents. Her scream was not the cry of a girl startled from sleep, nor the lament of a spoiled princess denied some trinket. It was the sound of something being broken, something unseen, yet more vital than flesh or bone. Even the eunuchs who guarded the doors, men hardened by decades of palace discipline, recoiled at the sound. They dared not enter, for the moment that produced such cries was forbidden, sealed behind curtains of ceremony, and wrapped in silence by decree. History rarely records screams, yet this one lingered in whispers, echoing down centuries, buried beneath the silks and jewels of imperial law. For behind the glittering facade of the Ottoman dynasty lay a truth carefully erased from the official chronicles, that the daughters of the Sultan, born into golden cages, were prepared for marriage with rituals so cruel that even the empire's enemies might have pitied them. To the outside world, the fate of an Ottoman princess seemed enviable. Writers in Europe and Persia describe palaces overflowing with silks, musicians, poets, and servants. They imagined princesses living as living jewels, untouched by hardship, destined to be adored. But the truth was far darker. For these girls, luxury was not freedom. It was a prison dressed in gold. Many prayed for death rather than face the destiny waiting for them on their wedding nights. To understand Fatma's tragedy, we must first step back into the empire that produced it. By the early 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was a force that both awed and terrified the world. From the deserts of Yemen to the gates of Vienna, the thunder of its armies shook kingdoms to their knees. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had transformed Istanbul into the beating heart of an empire-its skyline, crowned with domes, its markets humming with the goods of Asia, Africa, and Europe. At the center of it all stood Topkapı Palace, a city within a city, where power was not only wielded but also hidden, wrapped in layers of ritual and secrecy. Behind its guarded gates, the imperial harem formed a world unto itself. It was not merely a place of pleasure, as so many European travelers whispered, but a labyrinth of politics, education, intrigue, and silent wars. At its height, the harem housed more than 800 women concubines, servants, consorts, and princesses. Their lives intertwined like threads in an elaborate tapestry. Each move watched, each ambition weighed. The wrong gesture could mean ruin. The right smile could mean influence that shaped the empire's destiny. And yet, within this gilded prison, a paradox emerged. Many of the concubines women captured in wars or sold from distant markets found avenues of power unimaginable in their homelands. Some rose to become advisors to the Sultan, even regents of the empire. Their influence during the so-called Sultanate of Women was legendary. Harem Sultan, for instance, once a slave from Rith, became wife to Suleiman the Magnificent and reshaped imperial politics. Kaksem Sultan, Fatma's own mother, would one day wield power behind the veil with ruthless brilliance. But while concubines could rise, the true daughters of the Sultan were shackled by a different chain. They were pawns in the empire's grand game of survival, bound by marriage to men chosen not for love, not even for compatibility, but for political necessity. Their lives were bargaining chip tokens used to secure loyalty, pacify rivals, and seal alliances. The concubine might gain a throne, but the princess, she was the coin with which that throne was bought. It was into this world that Fatma Sultan was born in 1606. By all accounts, she was extraordinary, gifted, curious, and radiant with the promise of a life that might have been different had she been born outside those palace walls. Chroniclers praised her mastery of languages, her keen interest in astronomy, her elegance in poetry and calligraphy. She was a child who dreamed of the stars, who debated scholars with a wit that left even the learned men of the court astonished. But dreams did not matter in the empire of the Ottomans. Fatma's fate had been written before her first breath. She was destined to be given away in marriage as a symbol of power, a silent coin passed from sultan to statesman. And so, on that dawn in 1623, her scream marked not the beginning of tragedy, but its unveiling. For what awaited her was not merely a wedding, but a ritual, carefully constructed machinery of obedience designed to erase her will before she ever met her husband. That morning, Istanbul stirred with the usual hum of empire. Merchants unfurled carpets in the bazaars, muezzins called the faithful to prayer, and fishermen cast their nets into the Bosporus. None could hear the cries from behind the palace walls. None would have dared to ask, for the empire had long perfected the art of concealing horror beneath spectacle. And it is here, in the echoes of Fatma's scream, that we must pause and ask, what price did the empire demand of its own daughters to preserve its power? And why was this truth buried so carefully, hidden until secret archives spoke centuries later? The answer lies in the ritual that awaited Fatma, a ritual the Ottomans called sacred, but which was in truth a ceremony of breaking. From the moment she opened her eyes to the light of the palace, Fatma Sultan's destiny was not her own. She was the daughter of Sultan Ahmet I and Kaiksem Sultan, one of the most formidable women ever to walk the marbled corridors of Topkapı to the world. This birth should have meant privilege, protection, even power. Yet, in the empire's cold arithmetic, a princess was not cherished for her brilliance or beauty. She was an instrument, her body, her marriage, her very existence, woven into the tapestry of politics like a coin stamped and spent for loyalty. Fatma's childhood seemed charmed, almost deceptively so. She roamed perfumed gardens where fountains murmured, tracing constellations with curious eyes. Tutors drilled her in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. She devoured manuscripts of astronomy, law, and poetry, surprising older scholars with her confidence. Chroniclers described her as precocious, radiant, a young woman who seemed to hold the stars themselves in her gaze. But none of that brilliance mattered. Her fate had been sealed before she ever spoke her first word. Her betrothal came early, as such things often did. The empire needed stability, and the price of that stability was her hand. The man chosen was Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, soldier hardened by campaigns against Persia, a commander 20 years her senior, whose loyalty to the throne was unquestioned. For him, the union was a ladder to greater authority. For her, it was a descent into a labyrinth with no exit. Months before the wedding, Fatma was thrust into the machinery of preparation, a ritual the Ottomans cloaked in sanctity but which was, in truth, a crucible designed to break the will of royal daughters. It was called Turval and Mubarak, the sacred education. Only princesses endured it. Concubines, paradoxically, were spared. The woman who presided over Fatma's initiation was Gulnar Hatun, an iron-willed matron of 60 winters who had overseen the preparation of more than a dozen princesses. To outsiders, she might have seemed a kindly governess, but within the harem, she was both architect and warden of obedience. Under her gaze, Fatma was led into the Angelino d'Este bride's chamber. It glittered with Persian carpets, ivory panels, and scented lamps. Yet behind its ornament, it was no sanctuary. It was a prison disguised as paradise. Here, Fatma was taught to unlearn herself. Each dawn began with rituals of reverence, endless repetitions of bows, curtsies, and postures. She was required to master 18 distinct forms of obeisance: how to kneel when greeting, how to serve without lifting her eyes, how to lower her body in silence when awaiting her husband's presence. Even her walk was stripped of individuality. She was drilled in Uriu's Ensises, the silent walk, her steps measured, her head tilted exactly 30 degrees, her hands locked at her waist. Each movement was calculated to erase pride, to reduce a princess to a shadow of obedience. The cruelest part was her speech. A girl who once debated scholars in astronomy and history found her vocabulary reduced to 43 sanctioned words, expressions of gratitude, submission, or apology. Anything else was forbidden. Independent thought, sharp wit, or even casual laughter was punished with fasting, solitary confinement, or public humiliation before the harem. The brilliance that once lit her eyes was dimmed with each word swallowed, each thought silenced. The tribunal that judged her progress was made up of women and eunuchs, but, presiding above all, was her own mother, Kaiksem Sultan. The same mother who had once guided her hand across calligraphy scrolls, now evaluated her, not as a daughter, but as a token in the empire's market of power. Fatma was no longer a child of flesh and dreams. She was a vessel, a living treaty waiting to be sealed. Still, the darkest aspect of her training lurked beneath the palace itself. In underground chambers, replicas of bridal rooms had been constructed. Here, Fatma faced the ritual of talim and Gurdik rehearsals of the dreaded wedding night. Venetian artisans had crafted wax mannequins, grotesquely lifelike, their bodies sculpted to mimic reality. Instructors commanded her to perform gestures and acts no girl of her age should have known. Each reaction, her trembling hands, her tears, her whispered refusals, was noted in secret records. The more she resisted, the harsher the correction. Slowly, painfully, the girl who once mapped constellations in the night sky was reduced to silence. Her spirit, once so fiercely alive, bent beneath the weight of ritual. Each bow, each censored word, each nightmare rehearsal chipped away at her identity. What remained was not the radiant child prodigy who dreamed of the stars, but an apprentice to obedience, a ghost of herself fashioned for sacrifice. Her life, once hers, was now the empire's. A week before her wedding, Fatma Sultan was moved from the training chambers into the Gelin Keksku, the bride's pavilion. On the surface, it glittered like something from a miniature painting. Silk draperies embroidered with gold thread, fountains whispering in tiled alcoves, attendants gliding in silence. But beneath its beauty, every detail was engineered to remind Fatma of one truth, that her life no longer belonged to her. Her diet was strictly prescribed, as though her very body had to be sculpted into a vessel of submission. Each meal was a ritual: pomegranates for fertility, almonds for endurance, honey and goat's milk to sweeten the spirit. Spices imported from Yemen flavored her food, not for taste but for symbolism. Attendants whispered that certain herbs calmed the nerves, others dulled the will. Fatma soon learned that the meals were not meant to nourish but to condition her, to quiet the restless spark that once filled her mind with starlight. Her body was subjected to purification baths daily. She was lowered into marble tubs filled with rosewater, sandalwood oil, and ambergris brought across deserts from Somalia. Alchemismen, who might once have studied philosophy, or medicine in Samarkand, now measured powders and tinctures to add to the baths. Some substances induced drowsiness, others blurred the edge between dream and waking. Attendants murmured prayers as they anointed her skin, but the ritual was less spiritual than chemical, a slow reshaping of her body into something pliant. Even the air she breathed was laced with control. Incense of valerian root and poppy filled the pavilion, their fumes softening resistance, weaving haze around her thoughts. At times, Fatma would feel herself drifting as if she were both present and absent, her mind floating away while her body obeyed commands without question. The walls themselves became part of her imprisonment. Draped with tapestries embroidered with scenes of obedient wives and mothers, they told her what her future was meant to be. In those images, women lowered their heads, cradled children, and gazed upward at husbands who stood taller, grander, untouchable. The message was unmistakable. Her worth was not her own but measured by her compliance. And then came the mirrors. Venetian glass, prized across Europe, had been imported at great cost and placed throughout the pavilion. They were not arranged for vanity. They were arranged for surveillance. No matter where Fatma turned, she caught her own reflection, eating, kneeling, bathing, even weeping. This practice was called muraqab originally, a Sufi discipline of self-reflection, meant to draw the believer closer to God, but here it was corrupted into a weapon. Fatma was forced to watch herself constantly, every gesture reminding her of her role, every tear reflected back at her until she felt ashamed of resisting. She was made her own jailer. Days melted into nights, each indistinguishable. She became a prisoner not only of walls but of her own reflection. Scholars later compared this to what modern psychology calls internalized controller system, so effective that those enslaved become complicit in policing themselves. Fatma was not just locked in silk, she was locked inside her own mind. Meanwhile, the city outside pulsed with anticipation. Istanbul prepared for the imperial wedding with processions, banquets, and music that filled the air with celebration. But within the pavilion, the preparations carried a darker weight. Fatma was trained for the final ritual, divided into 3 levels of the nuptial pavilion, each stage crafted as a descent deeper into surrender. The first was Tayo, endless baths, prayers, and ointments laced with calming substances. To the world, it was sacred cleansing. To Fatma, it was the slow erasure of resistance. The second was Teslim, Katie, the floor of surrender. Here, she would be dressed in her bridal attire, a gown of white silk heavy with pearls, golden embroidery, and a crown so weighty it forced her posture into a permanent bow. Every detail of the garment was both ornament and restraint. Anklets slowed her step, bracelets tightened at her wrists, shoes with thick soles limited her movement. The gown transformed her into a living icon of obedience. The third was Sif Kati, the chamber of consummation. Its walls were covered with tapestries of conquest, armies triumphant, cities burning, princesses captured. The symbolism was deliberate. Just as the empire crushed cities and bent rulers to its will, so too would Fatma be conquered in her wedding bed. Even the bed itself was a tool of control, built with hidden cords and cushions soaked in calming oils. For the empire, this was a sacred ritual of continuity, the merging of blood and loyalty. For Fatma, it was a descent into a carefully designed theater of submission. And as the day approached, the girl who had once traced stars and debated scholars began to disappear. The pavilion's silks gleamed, the mirrors shone, and the city outside roared with celebration. But inside, a single truth remained. Fatma Sultan was no longer preparing for a wedding. She was preparing for obliteration. On the morning of March 15, 1623, Istanbul awoke to celebration. The city itself seemed to pulse like a great drum. Musicians filled the streets with shrill flutes and beating drums. Incense curled above processions, and Janissary soldiers paraded in their finest armor. To the people, this day was spectacle, the marriage of a princess, daughter of the Sultan, to a proven commander of the empire. It was a vision of imperial power woven into ritual. But for Princess Fatma Sultan, hidden behind the marble walls of Topkapı, the day was not a union, it was a sentence. Inside the palace, the festivities were overwhelming. Golden plates laden with figs and roasted lamb lined the banquet tables. Dancers from Andalusia spun in jeweled silks, musicians from Persia sang ballads of empire, and foreign ambassadors bowed in awe at Ottoman magnificence. Yet Fatma sat in silence. Chroniclers noted her lips pressed tight, her gaze hollow, her body trembling despite the cool March air. Doctors who watched discreetly described her symptoms as what we might now call panic: rapid breathing, cold sweats, an inability to swallow food. To the world outside, it was glory. To her, it was terror. As the feasting ended and torches were lit in the gardens, the most dreaded procession began. Fatma, veiled and draped in her heavy bridal gown, was led from the pavilion to the nuptial chambers, a building designed centuries earlier by Mehmed the Conqueror himself. Octagonal in shape, rising in 3 symbolic levels, it was less a home than a theater of submission. The first level, Tyre, was purification. Fatma was lowered into marble baths filled with rosewater and sandalwood. Oils were rubbed into her skin, ointments laced with diluted opium and mandrake applied to her temples. Alchemists recorded her shifting state, not peace, but a trance-like calm, a body dulled while the spirit silently screamed. The second level, Teslim Kati, was surrender. She was clothed in a bridal gown that seemed as heavy as armor. White silk embroidered with gold thread shimmered under lamplight, but hidden clasps and cords made it easy to restrain her. A crown pressed upon her head until her neck bent in submission. Anklets restricted her step, bracelets confined her wrists, even her shoes, thick-soled, forced her to move slowly, every stride a performance of compliance. She was no longer a girl, she was a living emblem, a breathing statue of obedience. Meanwhile, her husband Tubi, Kara Mustafa Pasha, prepared in a very different way. Surrounded by advisors and veterans, he was instructed in techniques of dominance, phrases meant to humiliate, gestures designed to assert power, the art of bending a princess not through affection but through intimidation. To the empire, this was no marriage of equals. It was a conquest, as deliberate as the storming of a city. Finally, Fatma was brought to the third level, Sif Kati, the chamber of consummation. Its walls were draped in tapestries depicting military triumphs, cities razed, and foreign rulers bound in chains. Every image was chosen to equate marital dominance with imperial victory. The bed itself was fitted with hidden cords, the cushions soaked in oils to calm resistance, the lighting arranged to soften her perception. The chamber was not a sanctuary, it was a battlefield where no weapon could protect her. When the procession withdrew and the doors closed, Fatma was left alone with Kara Mustafa Pasha. What followed was recorded not in chronicles meant for the public but in medical notes and coded reports hidden in archives. They describe a collapse of spirit so complete that it terrified even those hardened by palace discipline. Fatma trembled uncontrollably. Her voice dwindled to a faint whisper. Her eyes seemed to gaze at something far beyond the chamber, as though her soul had fled to escape what her body could not. Mustafa Pasha, schooled to expect resistance, at first mistook her silence for defiance. He applied the techniques taught to him: words sharp as daggers, gestures meant to frighten, physical pressure to overwhelm. But what he encountered was not rebellion, it was absence. Fatma was no longer there. The girl who once debated scholars and dreamed of constellations had retreated into dissociation, her spirit gone to survive what her body endured. The records speak of fainting, repeated collapses, internal bleeding. Physicians described her state as sakma shock so profound it was as if the soul had departed. To them, she was present in body but absent in essence. To modernize, it was trauma so severe that the mind detached from reality itself. And so the night passed, not as a celebration but as a conquest not of lands or armies, but of a young woman whose only crime was being born a princess in an empire that devoured its own daughters. When dawn broke over Istanbul, the city stirred in joy, believing the marriage sealed the empire's strength. But within Topkapı's private chambers, a different truth lingered. Fatma Sultan had survived the night, but the girl who had once lived inside her had been broken. The days that followed Fatma Sultan's wedding were a slow unraveling. What had broken in the nuptial chamber did not mend with time, it deepened, spreading like a shadow over the rest of her life. Court physicians noted her sudden muteness. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was in whispers so faint attendants leaned close to catch the words. Her appetite vanished. Servants fed her by hand, coaxing each bite as though she were a child again. At unexpected hours, she would collapse into weeping fits that lasted until her body shook with exhaustion. The worst affliction was what chroniclers called the sickness of fear. The mere presence of a man of entrusted eunuchs, who had guarded her since childhood, sent her into fits of panic. Her breathing grew shallow, her hands trembled, her eyes darted like a bird trapped in a cage. Palace doctors labeled it virginal melancholy, a phrase meant to soften the truth. In reality, it was trauma with no cure. The brilliant girl who once debated scholars of astronomy and law was gone. In her place remained a dim echo, a shadow fashioned to survive. Her marriage to Kara Mustafa Pasha became mechanical, devoid of affection. They had children, they appeared together at ceremonies, but behind closed doors, silence hung heavier than any jewel or crown. Later memoirs suggest that Mustafa himself sought refuge in endless campaigns and opium, as though drowning his guilt in distance and smoke. He was celebrated in the empire as a loyal commander, but in the quiet of his own chamber, he too carried the weight of what that night had destroyed. Fatma Sultan lived on in this hollow state for nearly 3 decades. She attended the rituals of empire, raised children, and moved through the palace as a figurehead. Yet those who knew her whispered that she was already dead in spirit. Her books gathered dust, her calligraphy tools lay untouched. The gardens where she once strolled, naming stars, grew silent. In 1652, she died at the age of 46. The official cause was listed as a brain fever, but the date of her death fell on the exact anniversary of her wedding night. To those in the palace, it was no coincidence. It was as if the memory, buried but never forgotten, had finally claimed her. Fatma's tragedy was not unique. Documents unearthed centuries later reveal that dozens of Ottoman princesses endured the same fate. Some fell into silence as she did. Others descended into madness, speaking to shadows no one else could see. A few disappeared from records entirely, their names erased, their lives swallowed by the empire's machinery. When traces could not be erased, the chroniclers disguised the truth in euphemism. A sudden illness, a delicate disposition, a quiet retreat. Behind such phrases lay unhealed wounds carved into young lives. Yet even within that darkness, there flickered sparks of resistance. Secret records speak of princesses who faked their deaths to escape second marriages, who smuggled messages to sisters through hidden codes, who dared to petition the Sultan for divorce in acts of unimaginable courage. Though their voices were nearly erased, the faint traces that survive remind us that even within systems of absolute control, whispers of defiance endure. Fatma Sultan's story exposes a paradox. The daughters of the most powerful ruler in the world were imagined as untouchable figures of wealth and beauty. In reality, they were trapped in a labyrinth of rituals so finely tuned that they stripped away not only freedom but identity itself. The harem, immortalized in art and fantasy as a paradise of silk and intrigue, was also a theater of imposed silences, smothered tears, and broken spirits. Her scream in 1623 was not the only one. It was simply the one loud enough, or long enough, to leave an echo for us to hear centuries later. And so we arrive at the question history leaves us with. How many other voices remain buried beneath ceremony and silence? In Ottoman palaces, in European courts, in Chinese dynasties, in Russian fortresses, how many women paid invisible prices so that empires could glitter untarnished before the world? Fatma Sultan's life forces us to peel back the mask of history, to see the human cost hidden behind crowns and rituals. It compels us to recognize that power often devours its own children, demanding sacrifices too terrible to name. The world remembers Ottoman princesses as figures of legend clad in jewels, surrounded by music and poetry, but behind that legend lies a scream, a silence, and a life erased. And now, as you sit with this story, I must ask, whose fate should we uncover next? A Russian Tsarina feared even by her own mother, a Chinese empress bound by rituals of cruelty, or a European princess traded like coin in the markets of power? History tried to bury their voices, but if you choose, we can unearth them together. If Fatma Sultan's story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video to keep her voice alive. Share in the comments which queen or princess you want us to uncover next. And subscribe so you never miss the hidden truths history tried to erase.